In 506 BC, the Athenians are on the rise. They have defeated two of their neighbors in battle, the Boeotians and the Chalcidians, and in doing so they have become much more powerful. The Spartans became jealous of this, and for the purpose of using force to reinstall the tyrant Hippias as ruler of Athens, they solicited the rest of their fellow Peloponnesians to join them in an alliance. And Hippias came from the city of Sigeon, seeking to regain his former tyranny, and the Spartans hosted a gathering to press their case for war against Athens. But this conclave would fail to result in a coalition. The Corinthians in particular opposed the war, and the aims of Sparta were thwarted, and Hippias had to return to Asia with his hopes disappointed. Herodotus writes, "When Hippias returned to Asia, he missed no opportunity to slander the Athenians to Artaphernes, and did all he could to bring about Athens' submission to himself and Darius." So just to explain the situation at this time, the Persians have conquered all of modern-day Turkey. Artaphernes is the Persian governor, and the Greek cities there are being ruled by tyrants that meet Persian approval. And Hippias, having failed to regain the tyranny over Athens with the help of the Spartans, now seeks to be made a tyrant over Athens with the help of the Persians. Herodotus continues, "The Athenians found out what Hippias was doing and sent messengers to dissuade the Persians from giving credence to exiles from Athens, but Artaphernes ordered them to take Hippias back if they wished to remain secure." Now, one of the territories that was under Persian rule was Ionia, in which the city of Miletus is located. And despising Persian rule, a man named Aristagoras went to Athens in perhaps 504 BC, and he entreats the Athenians to help them revolt against Persia. And in these lines, we arrive at the subject matter of this video. Herodotus writes, "When Aristagoras appeared before the Athenian people, he told them that Miletus was originally an Athenian colony, and therefore, since the Athenians were a great power, it was only fair and reasonable for them to offer protection to the Milesians." And Herodotus goes on to write, "After the Athenians had been won over, they voted to dispatch 20 ships to help the Ionians. These ships turned out to be the beginning of evils for both Hellenes and barbarians. The narrative that will result in the Battle of Marathon and Salamis, in the wars between Athens and Persia, has been initiated." This is where we would pick up this narrative, but this video is going to focus on issues of ancestry and origin stories in ancient Greece. When Aristagoras made reference to Miletus as an Athenian colony, he is invoking a distant Greek past which has no first-hand historian from that time period. Herodotus tells us that the Athenians were of Ionian ancestry in the same sentence that he tells us that the Spartans were of Dorian ancestry. So what are these? Dorians and Ionians. For this we have to rely on Apollodorus because this is shrouded in myth. Now the Dorians and the Ionians are 2 out of 4 distinct groups of Greek people, and their origin is described in Apollodorus at the tail end of the pagan flood myth. A man named Deucalion survives the pagan flood, and he had 3 grandsons by his son Hellen, from whom we get the word Hellenic and Hellas, and one of those 3 grandsons was Xuthus, and his 2 sons were Achaeus and Ion, from whom we get the Achaeans and the Ionians. And those 2 sons are given the Peloponnese. So the original inhabitants of the Peloponnese were Achaeans and Ionians. And as we know from Herodotus, the Achaeans drove out the Ionians, and that's why they're now in Asia in the time period we're talking about. So there is one particular story that took place in 507 BC, so it's just 3 years before the events we're talking about, with Aristagoras showing up in Athens to get these ships. 3 years earlier, the king of Sparta, Cleomenes, had entered Athens and, in Herodotus' words, had climbed up to the Acropolis with the intent of taking possession of it. He went to the inner chamber of the goddess to address her. But before he could pass through the doors, the priestess stood up from her throne and said, "Foreigner from Lacedaemon, go back and do not come into the shrine, for it is not lawful for Dorians to enter here. He replied, But woman, I am not a Dorian, I am an Achaean. We see a great deal at work here just through this story. I think we see three distinct attitudes. One, a preference not to be associated with a certain ancestry. We see that in the Spartan who does not want to be considered a Dorian. Two, a preference for claiming an association with a certain ancestry. We see this in the Spartan as well, who would prefer to consider himself an Achaean. And of course, in the policy of the priestess in the Acropolis, exclusions based on ancestry and derivation. So beginning with that first concept, that there is a natural human inclination to deny or to diminish part of our ancestry. The Athenians were not that eager to claim the Ionians as part of their ancestry. He writes, The Athenians shunned the name and did not wish to be called Ionians, and even now many of them seem to me to be ashamed of the name. Along these lines, there's a pretty funny line from the art critic Brian Sewell, nothing to do with ancient Greece, but rather to do with European Transylvanians. I've got no idea if he's onto something here, but it's just funny, so let's watch.
Now I put my foot in it again.
You were from Vienna?
Yes, as all real Austrian families, they were mixed. Vienna, Styria, Hungary, so Transylvania. No, Transylvania not.
Does no one ever admit to being Transylvanian?
So now what about the Spartan who would rather consider himself an Achaean as opposed to a Dorian? The Spartan association with Dorians is explained by Herodotus here. The Hellenes who became Spartans wandered extensively. Under Doros, son of Hellen, they dwelled in the land beneath Ossa and Olympus, and after a few migrations that Herodotus describes, they finally came to the Peloponnese, where they came to be called Dorians. So they were latecomers to this region of Greece known as the Peloponnese. The Achaeans have been there much longer. And anyone who sat down and listened to a story about those Achaeans would hear about these two great cities, Argos and Mycenae. And we read in Apollodorus how twin sons, Acrisius and Proitus, waged war for the kingdom. And in the course of the war, they were the first to invent shields. And Acrisius gained the mastery and had a daughter, Danae. And it was this Danae who was impregnated by Zeus, Apollodorus continues. Zeus had intercourse with her in the shape of a stream of gold which poured through the roof into Danae's lap. Acrisius afterwards learned that she had got a child, Perseus. This is the Perseus who would go on to slay the Gorgon, Medusa, and rescue the damsel, Andromeda. And Perseus and Andromeda would have a granddaughter named Alcmena, who would also have sex with Zeus and give birth to Hercules. If you were a Spartan listening to this story, would you rather be an Achaean or a Dorian? When you hear about how infused was the blood of the kings of these two Achaean cities, Argos and Mycenae, with that of the gods. But regardless of who was what, when we read Greek literature, there can be no doubt that they cared about deifying their ancestry. That is clear when we read Apollodorus, and that will be clear when we look at some of these lines from the Iliad, the idea of ancestral superiority. Take these lines from Book 2 of the Iliad regarding the king of Mycenae, Agamemnon, as he prepares to assemble his troops. Homer writes, Across his shoulder slung his silver-studded sword. Then he seized the royal scepter of his fathers. Its power can never die. And grasping it tightly, off he strode to the ships of Argives, armed in bronze. And later, in Book 11, when Agamemnon actually takes the field and fights, he is not described as though he is some pansy nobleman whose real qualities are ill-suited to the rank he holds. He is described as though he is a lion in comparison to the deer that the Trojans are. Here are the lines from the Alexander Pope translation. The Trojans see the youth's untimely die, but helpless tremble for themselves and fly, so when a lion ranging o'er the lawns finds on some grassy lair the couching fawns, their bones he cracks, their reeking vitals draws, and grinds the quivering flesh with bloody jaws. These Trojans are prey like deer in the mouth of the lion. That is Homer's description of Agamemnon's person on the battlefield. But perhaps the greatest demonstration that the person of a Greek king was worthier than the person of his subordinates comes in Book 21 of the Odyssey, when the suitors to Penelope cannot string Odysseus's bow. These are the lines from the Fagles translation. Book 21, Eurymachus held the bow in his hands, turning it over tip to tip before the blazing fire to heat the weapon. But he failed to bend it even so, and the suitor's high heart groaned to bursting. And Eurymachus says this: "What breaks my heart is the fact we fall so short of great Odysseus' strength, we cannot string his bow, a disgrace to ring in the ears of men to come." Homer thought to signal to future generations that you are no Odysseus. It may have wearied 6th century Athenians to hear lines like that. And when we turn to some lines from Herodotus, we can see this in what he says about Cleisthenes of Sicyon, grandfather to the Cleisthenes we've already discussed. He must have hated lines like these to hear the Argives described as the greatest warriors by far, and not people of his own lineage. Herodotus writes, Cleisthenes, after going to war with the Argives, made an end of minstrels' contests at Sicyon by reason of the Homeric poems, because well nigh everywhere in these it is Argive and Argos that are the theme of the song. So from all of this, we can see that there may have been a feeling in Athens and Sparta that the heroic Greek past was an awe-inspiring legacy against which the martial glory obtained in the 500s BC was less considerable. And so, attainment of the compliment that you were a continuator of that Homeric Mycenaean greatness was more easily acquired as a descendant rather than as an imitator of the Achaean heroes of the Iliad, as well as Hercules and Perseus. But while the Spartans seem to have unblinkingly claimed their Herculean lineage, the Athenians had a more complicated relationship with their ancestry. When we recall the reforms of Cleisthenes in changing the names of the Athenian tribes, Herodotus had written, he, as in Cleisthenes, organized the Athenians into 10 tribes in place of their earlier division into 4 tribes, and he abolished the previous names, which had been derived from the names of the sons of Ion, replacing them with the names of local heroes that he discovered. So we see Cleisthenes trying to eliminate the Ionian legacy from the mindset of Athens, but we also see him searching for something to replace it. What do we make of these lines, local heroes that he discovered? Do we suspect him of making these people up? Or if he didn't make them up, of finding a name on a tombstone and raising that dead person who no one knows into some hero of great renown? If they were well known to anyone, Herodotus does not say so. It seems to me that there was a great deal of ancestral fixation, and that ancestral fixation is a veil for envy. Something about present circumstances fails to meet with an elevated sense that a people has of itself, and the solution is to claim superiority over others by right of birth, and to decline to find it proper that excellence is to be demonstrated through worthy proofs and deeds. Now to the concept of exclusivity based on your ancestral affiliation. We saw it in the words of the priestess in the Athenian Acropolis. We see it also in the policy of the Ionians in Asia. Herodotus writes, the Ionians organized themselves into just 12 cities in Asia and refused to admit any more. And he continues to say that these 12 cities gloried in it, and even built a sanctuary just for themselves, calling it the Pan-Ionian. And they decided in joint council that none of the other Ionians should share it with them, although none wanted to, except Smyrna. The Ionians of Asia, then, were very keen to claim their old Peloponnesian ancestry and consider themselves to be the descendants of the cream of the old Ionian nobility. Herodotus implies that they thought highly of themselves, or else the following confutation would not have been necessary. It is very foolish to claim that these Asian Ionians are in any way more Ionian or more noble in birth than any of the others. Herodotus would not have needed to say this had they not thought it of themselves. And later on, an apparently exasperated Herodotus writes, "Since the Ionians of Asia want to be called Ionians more than the others of that name, let them be known as the purebred Ionians." I love Herodotus. You want to make a fuss? Go ahead. But he does give the history of Ionian intermingling here in Book 1 of his histories. Those who set out from the Prytanean of Athens may have believed themselves to be the most nobly born of the Ionians, but they did not bring their own women with them to settle in their colony. What they did when they got there was to seize carrion women after murdering their menfolk. And Herodotus also writes, many other peoples are mixed in among them, and he goes on to name them at length. In showing his amusement and critical contempt of all of this obsessing, Herodotus reminds me of Daniel Defoe, who had some things to say about the English who thought too highly of their own noble birth and lineage. Defoe writes, making reference to the many people who have conquered and come to England over the years, "No Roman now, no Briton does remain. Wales strove to separate, but strove in vain. The silent nations undistinguished fall, and Englishmen's the common name of all. Fate jumbled them together, God knows how. Whate'er they were, they're true-born English now. The wonder which remains is at our pride, to value that which all wise men deride. For Englishmen to boast of generation cancels their knowledge and lampoons the nation. A true-born Englishman's a contradiction, in speech and irony, in fact a fiction. He made her firstborn race to be so rude, and suffered her so oft to be subdued, by several crowds of wandering thieves o'errun, often unpeopled and as oft undone, while every nation in her powers reduced, their languages and manners introduced, from whose mixed relics our compounded breed by spurious generation does succeed. From this amphibious ill-born mob began that vain ill-natured thing, an Englishman."